Story number 1. The Curse of Superior's Depths. I always thought Lake Superior was a thing of beauty, something out of an old postcard you'd pick up in a sleepy Michigan gift shop. Dark blue waters reflecting rolling clouds. The distant silhouette of pines on a rocky shoreline. A sense of calm that blankets you if you stare long enough. But now, after what we found down there, I can't look at it the same way. It's more than an inland sea. More than the largest of the Great Lakes. There's something alive in those depths, something that's been waiting for over a century to be discovered. And I wish to God we never went searching. I'm a professional diver, though I suppose I wasn't always so professional. I started as a thrill-seeking college student, exploring wrecks off the Florida coast with some cheap gear my uncle passed down to me. Over time, my love for the unknown turned into a decent living, scanning the bottoms of lakes and oceans, documenting sunken vessels for museums or private owners, or sometimes just the curiosity of wealthy hobbyists. That's how I ended up on Lake Superior last winter, joined by a small crew of misfits, one of them my best friend, Cal, who'd staked his entire career on discovering a piece of maritime history. Cal's the type who reads every shipwreck database, collects old newspaper clippings, and scours archives for lost manifests. He's convinced that the Great Lakes hide innumerable secrets, ghost ships, fortune-laden steamers, entire histories swallowed by ice and waves. It was his idea to head up to Superior in January. The conditions will be awful, I told him. Blizzards, sub-zero temperatures, the kind of cold that cracks your wetsuit. But he looked at me with that old spark in his eye. We have to see this wreck before it disappears from the records forever, he said. Besides, we won't find anything interesting if we only go diving when it's comfortable. If I'd known what we were about to awaken, I would have thrown his research into the fireplace and locked him in his hotel room. We never would have gone near the water. But I was a stubborn idiot. I shrugged, cracked a smile, and said, sure. Why not? We arrived at a small lakeside town in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, where the lonely highway stretched on through the pines, and the parking lot of our motel was already buried in 2 feet of snow. The place smelled of stale coffee and cheap disinfectant. Snow drifts rattled against the windows all night, making me think of tapping fingers. I barely slept. The next morning, we gathered in the lobby, joined by the rest of our group. Maria, a marine archaeologist who'd once spent 6 months in the Caribbean studying coral reefs, but found the Great Lakes more interesting than any tropical paradise. Don, the tech whiz, who could wire up a submersible camera faster than you could say Shipwreck, though he had a mouthful of conspiracy theories about aliens and lake monsters. Margaret, a local historian with a soft, breathy voice. She'd uncovered the tale of a cargo vessel lost in the Great Storm of 1913, an event that claimed dozens of ships and hundreds of lives across the Great Lakes. According to her old documents, this cargo ship, christened the Street Magnus, never even sent out a distress signal. She believed it sank somewhere off the southern coast of Superior without a soul left to tell its fate. It was Margaret's rumor and Cal's obsession that led us onto the ice-crusted docks that day. They had circled a promising area on the battered lake charts, somewhere near the outskirts of Whitefish Bay, a deep basin known to swallow wrecks. Don brought a full array of equipment, including high-res sonar, digital cameras, and something he called a spectral resonator, which he insisted was for measuring temperature anomalies. I suspected he'd be using it to hunt for ghosts, but I didn't mock him too much. Because, deep down, we all had that itch. The Great Lakes were notoriously haunted, or so the stories said. I remember the air being so cold my lungs burned. The wind sliced across my cheeks. As we packed the boat, I glanced out over Superior. Its surface seemed impossibly gray, flecked with white caps that crashed against the shore. An older fisherman, seeing us load up, shook his head. Bad time of year, he muttered. It's the season of storms. You should head back south. Cal just grinned. We'll be fine, sir, he said. We've got the best gear money can buy. The old man glared at the choppy water. Not sure money helps out there, he said quietly. We pressed on anyway. We boarded our modest research vessel, nothing fancy, but stable enough to handle some rough seas. The plan was straightforward: motor out to the coordinates, lower our sonar, and see if we could pick up the shape of the Street Magnus on the lakebed. If it looked promising, we'd dive. The waves were relentless. Each time our hull smacked the surface, it felt like an earthquake rattling my ribs. Maria huddled near the stern, eyeing the horizon with a pale face. Margaret tried to distract her with some local legends, stories of ghost lights on the water, the lady in white who appears near Christmas, the spectral crew of the Edmund Fitzgerald, who apparently sing in the howling winds. Meanwhile, Cal and Don fiddled with the sonar. Don booted up his laptop and began scanning the readouts. Depth is almost 700 feet in some spots, he said. That's a monster dive. Temperature hovers near freezing. No kidding, I replied, already feeling the chill seep through my jacket. Then the sonar pinged. A soft beep, like a heartbeat on a monitor. Don's eyes lit up. He refined the feed and magnified a section on the screen. There's something big down there, he said. The image was far from clear, but I could make out a shape that might be a ship's hull, measuring over 200 feet in length. That's about the same size as the Street Magnus, Margaret whispered. She retrieved a tattered ledger from her backpack, flipping to a page describing the vessel. It was hauling timber and iron ore. Some accounts say it had a small crew of 15. Cal nodded, a grin creeping across his face. He turned to me. We should get suited up. I forced a smile, though my stomach twisted. We all had a primal fear of Lake Superior in winter. You don't take it lightly. But the lure of a legendary wreck was too strong. The thought of discovering it first, documenting everything, maybe even finding personal artifacts of the crew, overrode common sense. We readied the dive gear, dry suits, regulators, full-face masks, underwater lights, cameras. Maria insisted we use a tether system for safety. The water was far too cold and deep for any mistakes. Don prepared his spectral resonator, ignoring my rolled eyes. Soon, the boat rocked gently above the sonar target. Snow flurries dotted the sky. I stood at the stern, heart pounding, listening to the muffled roar of the wind. Ready? Cal asked me, his voice sounding tinny through his mask. I nodded. As ready as I'll ever be. And then we plunged into the blackest water I've ever seen. The moment I descended below the surface, the cold stabbed through me like tiny needles. Even with a dry suit, Superior's winter water seeped into my bones. My breath sounded loud in my helmet, anxious, gasping. The deeper we went, the less light penetrated. Our flashlights cut narrow beams through the void, revealing only swirling plankton and drifting sediment. At around 100 feet, I thought I saw something shift in the darkness, a faint movement beyond the range of my light. But when I swung my beam around, there was only black water. My ears rang with an odd hum, like static in an old radio. We pressed downward. 200 feet. 300. I fought the pressure building behind my mask. Cal signaled for me to keep calm, so I popped my ears, exhaled slowly. Maria hovered nearby, eyes alert, scanning the gloom. Don's spectral resonator was strapped to his chest like a baby carrier, blinking with erratic green lights. At 400 feet, shapes started to form, battered timbers, a broken mast, a scattered field of debris. Then, through the murk, we saw her, the hull of a large cargo ship, resting on its side. The name on the prow was barely legible, corroded by decades of silt and ice, but I made out faint lettering, St. Magnus. It's hard to describe the emotion that welled up inside me, excitement, fear, a weird sadness. The wreck's silhouette loomed in the gloom, a sleeping giant. All around it lay lumps of cargo containers, the remains of crates that had burst open on impact. A deck rail was twisted like a broken spine. We approached cautiously. Cal let out a muted whoop of triumph, but it crackled into my earpiece like a dying radio broadcast. Maria snapped photos with her underwater camera. I flicked on my secondary flashlight, sweeping over the rusted metal, the peeling planks. That's when I felt a curious shift in the water, a sudden swirl, as though something large had passed behind me. My heart hammered. I turned. Nothing. Then Don's voice cut in over the comm. Guys, I'm getting some weird readings. What kind of readings? Cal asked, drifting around the starboard side. I don't know. Temperature fluctuations. Sudden drops, then spikes. I tried to calm the goosebumps rising on my arms. Could be pockets of different currents, I said, but my voice trembled. Maria pointed to what looked like an entrance to the lower deck, a gaping doorway. We followed her in, scanning the interior. The corridor was half collapsed, beams of rotted wood forming tangles like spider webs. Floating silt plumed around us, and I kept expecting to see fish, or maybe eels, darting among the wreckage. But there was nothing, no life, no movement, just silence. I say silence, but that's not quite right. Because as we ventured deeper, I heard something. A dull, far-off thumping, like a heartbeat behind the walls. I swallowed hard. Anyone else hear that? I whispered. Maria nodded, eyes wide behind her mask. We turned a corner and entered what might have been a crew's quarters. A row of rust-eaten bunks lined the walls. Black water lapped at the decaying mattresses. I caught a glimpse of a pair of boots stuck beneath a collapsed beam. The leather was unbelievably well preserved in Superior's cold water. Something about it unsettled me, like a foot might still be in there. Cal approached a small trunk. When he tugged it open, a cloud of silt rose, revealing a battered journal, pages glued together by time. He tucked it into a watertight bag, obviously excited. But then Don let out a sudden yelp. Holy crap, he stammered. I just saw a face. A face? I repeated, my heart in my throat. Outside the corridor, peering in through the broken window. I swear to God, it looked like a man. Pale and bloated. Maria exhaled sharply. Don, maybe you're just seeing your reflection. No, it wasn't me. It was someone else. We all paused, tension crackling through the comms. Then Cal pointed to the bunkhouse doorway. Let's see if it's still there, he said, though his voice wavered. I didn't want to look. But we swam out, flashlights slicing across the corridor. Broken planks bobbed. Shadows danced. No face. No figure. But the feeling didn't go away. I could sense eyes on me, a presence swirling in the silt-laden water. After what felt like hours, we decided to surface. We documented enough to confirm the wreck was indeed the Street Magnus. We planned to come back for more thorough exploration in a day or two. On our ascent, I felt that strange swirl of water behind me again, as if something were following. I forced myself not to panic. When we finally broke through the surface, the sky was dark and a light snowfall dusted the boat. We hauled ourselves aboard, shivering and exhausted. I peeled off my mask, gulping the frigid air. Maria was first to speak. That was incredible, she said, forcing a small grin. We actually found it. Don looked rattled, glancing back at the water. You guys don't think I'm crazy, do you? He asked. Cal exchanged a glance with me. No, I said, though I couldn't quite meet his eyes. Let's just get warm. Maybe we'll talk later. We secured the gear and hurried back toward shore, the boat tossing in the icy waves. As we approached the docks, the wind intensified. Snow whipped across our faces. Once we tied up, we hurried to the motel. We needed hot showers, strong coffee, anything to chase away the chill. That night, the storm arrived. I've experienced some nasty winter storms in my life, but this one felt different. The wind shrieked like a living thing, rattling the motel windows. Outside, the world was a swirl of white. Power lines bowed under ice. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that hulking wreck in the darkness, felt that presence lurking behind me. Around midnight, I startled awake, heart pounding. I'd heard something in the hall, heavy footsteps, or so I thought. I flicked on the bedside lamp. My breath caught in my throat, my reflection in the mirror looked pale, drained. I could have sworn the doorknob rattled, but when I checked, no one was there. Just the howling wind beyond the thin walls. The next morning, we gathered in the motel's tiny lobby, bleary-eyed. Don looked like he hadn't slept at all. I heard voices, he said quietly, stirring a cup of instant coffee. Like men shouting. Could have been the wind, but he trailed off. Maria shot him a sympathetic look. Let's just focus on the evidence we collected. Cal pulled out the journal we'd recovered and carefully pried it open. The pages were water-stained, the ink blurred. But some lines were still legible. Margaret hovered over his shoulder, reading in hushed tones. The storm grows worse. November 9th, 1913. Captain says we must keep going. Wave upon wave. Men are afraid. She flipped another page, carefully. Hull battered. Something in the water. Not a whale or fish. A voice. Margaret's hands trembled. She continued. Crew hears it. Whispering in the wind. We cannot escape. Cal swallowed hard. Sounds like they encountered something supernatural before they sank. Don exhaled sharply. So they were hearing voices, too. I looked out the window at the whiteout conditions. My gut churned. Something about this place, this wreck, felt undeniably wrong. Maybe we should just document everything from the surface, I muttered. We have sonar, photos from the first dive. Let's call it done. Cal shook his head. You know we can't do that, he said softly. This is the discovery of a lifetime. We can't just walk away. I knew he was right, academically speaking. But I couldn't shake the dread that gnawed at my insides. The storm raged for 2 full days, stranding us. We used the time to analyze the footage. Maria's underwater camera had captured the ship's corridors, the broken bunkhouse. On the recordings, I noticed wisps of shadow that I hadn't seen in person, almost like silhouettes drifting across the frame. Don insisted on playing the audio at high volume. At one point, I heard a faint knocking, like someone tapping on the hull from the inside. By the second night, cabin fever set in. The 5 of us argued whether to mount another dive. Cal and Margaret were all for it. Maria was on the fence, eager for more data, but wary of the risks. Don seemed torn, too, though curiosity tugged at him. I was the lone holdout, I suppose. I don't think it's safe, I said. Not physically, not mentally. Margaret looked at me with eyes that glittered with excitement. What if we find the captain's log? Or personal effects? This could rewrite our knowledge of that entire storm. Families might get closure, descendants of the crew. I bit my tongue. A part of me wanted closure, too. But something told me that closure wasn't what we'd find. On the 3rd morning, the storm eased, though the lake was still churning. We decided to head back out. The same fisherman from before stood near the pier, shaking his head at our stupidity. You folks got guts, he said. Or you got a death wish. We set out again, braving the waves. The wind had died down, but the sky remained iron gray. Ice crusted the rails of the boat. My stomach knotted as we approached the coordinates once more, the sonar beep echoing in my ears. We anchored above the wreck, the boat pitching with each swell. This time, only 4 of us would dive, me, Cal, Maria, and Don. Margaret stayed topside to monitor communications and stand by with emergency protocols. Be careful down there, she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. We strapped on our gear, exchanging uneasy glances. Then we slipped beneath the waves again, into the cold blackness. Immediately, I felt that suffocating presence, like something was waiting. As we descended, Don's voice crackled over the comm, temperatures dropping fast. Maria responded, I'm reading it, too. We've got a 5-degree drop in less than 20 feet. We reached the deck of the Street Magnus, shining our lights on the corroded metal. The corridor we'd explored last time looked darker, as if the shadows had grown thicker. I tried to keep calm, focusing on the task, gather more evidence, retrieve artifacts if possible, then get the hell out. Cal led the way inside. The bunkhouse was as we left it, though more silt floated in the water. A broken door listed on its hinges. My flashlight beam caught movement near the rear wall, like a shape darting away. I froze, but it was gone before I could identify it. We drifted deeper into the guts of the ship. The cargo hold, which used to carry iron ore and timber, was a gaping cavern. Our lights revealed huge stacks of rotted crates, twisted metal beams overhead. The water felt strangely thick, somehow. Like it clung to us. Suddenly, a swirling vortex of sediment enveloped us. My visibility dropped to near zero. I heard Maria gasp, then Cal's frantic voice, Don? Don. When the silt settled, Don was gone. "Don, respond," Cal demanded, shining his flashlight wildly. We saw no sign of him, just drifting bits of rust and algae. Maria's voice shook. "Where could he have gone?" I tried to keep it together. "Don? Don, if you can hear me, click your light twice." Silence. Then we heard a faint moan over the comm, low, distorted, as if from miles away. It didn't sound like Don at all. It sounded old. Ancient. Cal pointed to a narrower passage. He might have been dragged by the current. "Let's go." We pushed forward, the corridor narrowing until we had to move single file. I felt pressure building in my ears, but fear overshadowed physical discomfort. My mind spun with a single thought: something took Don. We entered a small chamber, maybe the mess hall of the ship. Long tables, rotted benches. Stalactites of algae hung from the ceiling. And at the far end of the room floated a cluster of shapes. My stomach twisted in horror as my light revealed them. 5 or 6 men, their bodies pale and withered, eyes sunken, hair billowing in the water. Their mouths hung open in silent screams. They were corpses, sure, but they were moving. Maria let out a muffled shriek. One of the figures turned its head toward us, eyes empty sockets. In the flicker of our beams, I swear I saw its mouth form a single word: help. Cal tried to back away, but the door behind us slammed. Yes, it actually slammed shut in the water. A pulse of pressure rocked the room. The corpses drifted closer, arms outstretched. Their rotted uniforms bore the faint insignia of the Street Magnus. Suddenly, a swirling mass of darkness seemed to seep from the hole, coiling around our feet like ink. I felt my limbs grow heavy, an unseen force tugging at me. Maria thrashed, her eyes wild. Cal's flashlight flickered. Then, out of the swirling dark, a face emerged, gaunt, with black holes for eyes. Its mouth gaped, releasing a torrent of water that roared through the chamber. In that thunderous cascade, I heard voices, men crying out, begging for salvation, cursing the storm. A relentless echo of the final moments of the Street Magnus. I screamed into my comm, but no sound came out. My lungs burned. I lost sight of Maria and Cal, swallowed by the current. Then everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I came to, I was lying on the floor of the mess hall, half buried in silt. My flashlight was gone, so I flicked on a small backup. My head pounded. The water was murky, swirling with debris. Through the haze, I saw them again, the corpses, drifting near the ceiling. Motionless now, their arms slack. I heard muffled sobs over the comm. It was Maria. "Maria," I croaked, pushing myself upright. "Maria, can you hear me?" She appeared from behind an overturned table, her suit torn at the sleeve, eyes wide with terror. "Where's Cal?" she whispered. I shook my head, scanning the darkness. No sign of him. No sign of Don either. I felt a stab of guilt and terror. We found the door again, forced it open. The corridor outside was unrecognizable, twisted by whatever force had just swept through. My sense of direction faltered. We tried to follow the line we'd used to guide us, but it was severed. We drifted through the corridors, frantically searching. Now and then, we heard a dull banging, as if someone was hammering on the hull. We tried to follow the noise, but it echoed all around us, leading nowhere. At some point, Maria froze and grabbed my arm, shining her light on a corner of the corridor. There, pinned beneath a collapsed beam, was Don. At first, I thought he was dead, but then his head lolled. Bubbles dribbled from his regulator. We pried the beam off him, and he stirred, his eyes fluttering open. The spectral resonator was cracked, blinking erratically. Don's voice rasped over the comm. They're everywhere." We propped him up, but he could barely swim on his own. We tried to ascend, but the structure overhead had caved in, blocking our path. The only option was to push deeper, hoping to find another exit. That's when we saw the shadows. They moved along the walls, flickering like candlelight on wet stone. Dark silhouettes in the shape of men, sailors, presumably. They seemed to be pointing, gesturing for us to follow. And God help me, we did. Fear and hope tangled in my mind. Maybe they were leading us to safety. Or maybe they were leading us somewhere else. We ended up in a chamber that looked like the captain's quarters, richer paneling, a decaying desk littered with shattered glass. The shadows hovered near a corner, beckoning. Maria hesitated, but I swam closer, scanning the area with my flashlight. There, lying partially beneath a collapsed bookshelf, was Cal. He was unconscious, helmet askew. My chest flooded with relief. Maria and I tugged him free, checking his vitals. He was alive, but unresponsive. In the glow of the flashlight, I saw a spirit, a translucent figure standing behind the desk. It wore a tattered captain's coat, a patch over one eye. Its lips moved, but no sound emerged. Then it raised an arm, pointing at the ceiling. A rush of bubbles escaped my mouth as I realized it was directing us upward, to an opening near the top of the cabin. An escape route. I mustered every ounce of courage. With Maria's help, we lifted Cal and Don through the debris, aiming for the tear in the hull. The spirit watched, expression inscrutable. Before I could process any rational thought, the temperature plummeted. My body shook violently in the cold. The spirit's form flickered, and a surge of dark water poured in. We scrambled through the gap, dragging Cal and Don behind us. My lungs burned from the effort. A final push, and we emerged outside the wreck. I looked down. Those pale corpses were drifting out of the hull now, half floating, half walking along the lakebed, their faces twisted in sorrow. They all stared up at me as though begging for release. My heart shattered. And then, like a final exhale, the ship seemed to collapse inward, sending a plume of silt roiling. In that swirl, I glimpsed the captain's ghostly face once more, and I swear he mouthed the words, "Take them home." We ascended as fast as we dared, mindful of decompression sickness. By some miracle, we reached the surface. The storm had subsided to a gentle snow. Margaret helped us onto the boat, eyes brimming with tears at the sight of Cal and Don half-conscious. We administered oxygen, helped them peel away their masks. They coughed and sputtered, but they were alive. We didn't speak much on the trip back. I felt no sense of triumph, only grief and a haunting dread, as though the eyes of that drowned crew were still upon me. Back at the motel, we warmed ourselves by the electric heater. Don recounted what he could remember, being pulled by an invisible force, seeing faces contorted in agony. Cal, once he'd recovered enough to talk, described hearing frantic voices urging him deeper, as if they wanted him to join them. Maria and I shared a look, recalling the moment we saw the captain's ghost pointing us to freedom. It seemed that not all the spirits in that wreck were malevolent. Some might have simply wanted us to bear witness, to know they were down there, trapped in the quiet darkness since 1913. Margaret, with tears in her eyes, whispered, "Their souls are still there." What do we do? I had no easy answer. We'd found the street Magnus, but in doing so, we disturbed something. We glimpsed the line between life and death, and discovered how thin it can be when you're hundreds of feet underwater, in a place where storms rage and the cold never leaves. We sent all our documentation to the local Maritime Museum and wrote a careful report. Officially, we cited dangerous diving conditions as our reason for ceasing further exploration. We never mentioned ghosts or curses. Who would believe us anyway? Cal sometimes calls me late at night, saying he hears knocking on his walls, like the hull of a ship battered by waves. Don has nightmares about pale faces in the darkness, reaching for him. Maria tries to bury herself in work, but she can't forget that swirling black water. And me? Every time I close my eyes, I see those shadowy figures drifting in the corridors, waiting for someone to set them free. Lake Superior is calm again, or so they say. But I know better. I can feel the presence still there, below the surface, a restless legion of lost souls. The Great Lakes have claimed thousands of lives, but the Street Magnus is special. It sank in a ferocious snowstorm, sealed in ice and fear. And the spirits of that crew, they haven't moved on. They're trapped in time, drowning over and over again in the gloom. Sometimes, on a quiet morning, I'll wake up hearing that faint, spectral whisper, "Take them home." And I'll wonder if they're calling me back, tempting me to return to Superior's depths, to face the souls that wander the sunken hallways. But I won't go back. I can't. Because some doors, once opened, should never be opened again. And so the waters remain dark, the wreck slumbering at the bottom, haunted by memories of that final storm. For anyone foolhardy enough to dive there, consider this my warning: Lake Superior keeps her secrets. And if you're not careful, you might join those lost mariners, trapped beneath the ice-cold waves, forever reaching for salvation that never comes. Story number 2. The Haunting of Charleston Harbor. I've always been drawn to things that lie below the surface. My name is Matthew Graham, and I'm an underwater archaeologist, which means I spend half my life prying into the secrets of shipwrecks, sunken relics, and all the other dreams that sank to the ocean floor. Most days, I'm elbow deep in rotted timbers and sea silt, chasing after an echo of history that might never come. But I can't help it, digging up the past is my calling. I never thought my calling would lead me to a nightmare. Charleston, South Carolina, is a place of antebellum charm, pastel mansions, cobblestone streets, live oaks dripping with Spanish moss. But the city's genteel facade hides a darker history. In the 18th century, it was one of the busiest ports on the eastern seaboard. Merchants came for trade, pirates for plunder. Rumors of swashbuckling rogues and hidden treasure still drift along its humid streets like old ghosts. I arrived in Charleston for a research project tied to the university. My department had received a private grant from a local historical society. Word was, there might be a pirate ship, allegedly belonging to the infamous Captain Avery, lying somewhere off the coast. According to half-baked legends and 18th century naval records, the British Royal Navy had cornered Avery's brig in a violent skirmish not far from Charleston Harbor. Cannon fire lit up the twilight sky, and the pirate ship supposedly sank with all hands on board. No one ever found it. Not until now. Before I began my formal search, I spent a few nights wandering Charleston's Battery Park, gazing out at the harbor. Locals told me about the lights. Sometimes, on a quiet night, a faint glow appears over the water, shimmering like a lantern. Others claim to hear muffled cannon fire echoing across the waves. Over the centuries, folks have chalked it up to swamp gas, shifting tides, or just a good old southern ghost story. I figured it was all folklore until the first night I saw it. I was sitting on a weathered bench near White Point Garden, the thick summer air clinging to my skin. Across the bay, darkness settled in. Then came a flicker, far out on the horizon, brief, almost like a lightning flash. I squinted, leaning forward. Another faint glow, bobbing gently. And then, softer than a dying heartbeat, a distant boom. I tried to tell myself it was some late-night cargo ship or a boat testing out fireworks. But there was no sign of any vessel. No silhouette against the moonlit sky. Just that lingering, flickering glow before it vanished. A chill crept along my spine. When the grant money came through, I assembled a small group of experts for the underwater excavation. This wasn't a major operation. We wanted to keep it quiet to avoid treasure hunters or local press sensationalism. We set up shop in a rundown boathouse not far from the city marina. My colleagues included Dr. Fiona Cortez, a marine historian who could spot a centuries-old coin from a mile away, Nate Holloway, an experienced diver who'd served in the Navy and didn't scare easy, and Caroline Lambert, a graduate student specializing in colonial-era artifacts. She was bright-eyed, too enthusiastic for her own good, but dedicated. Together, we combed through old charts, cross-referencing them with modern sonar scans. Sure enough, we identified an anomaly off the eastern channel leading into Charleston Harbor. It rested about 70 feet below the surface, partially buried under sand and silt. The shape matched an 18th century brig. My heart pounded when we saw the sonar readout, a length consistent with historical accounts, and a structure that might have been a cannon deck. No absolute guarantee it belonged to Captain Avery's crew, of course, but it was the best lead in decades. As a precaution, I contacted the local historical society and the Coast Guard. We got the green light for an initial dive. Our little expedition was set to begin. We took a modest dive boat out to the coordinates, the harbor's wind pushing salty air into my nostrils. The sun was harsh, bouncing off the water in sparkling shards. Charleston's skyline receded behind us, the spire of St. Michael's Church glinting in the distance. Our plan was simple: a short reconnaissance dive to confirm the wreck's identity, gather basic documentation, then come back for a more thorough excavation if it proved promising. Nate helped me into my gear. The water temperature was comfortable enough this time of year, though the currents could be tricky. Fiona triple-checked the diving schedule, ticking off each box on her waterproof clipboard. Caroline fussed with the underwater camera, giddy, her grin shining brighter than the sun. We did our final checks and slipped into the ocean. The visibility wasn't great, maybe 15 feet, with swirling silk that parted in ribbons under my flashlight. But as I sank deeper, the outline of a ship emerged before my eyes, tilted on its side, timbers half buried, barnacles clinging to what remained of the hull. A sense of awe filled my chest. It was definitely old, though it eaten through in places by centuries of salt and sea life. I could make out jagged edges that looked like cannon ports, and even an iron anchor lying crooked in the sand. Caroline swam close, shining her light over the rotted deck. She pointed excitedly at a metal piece jutting from the silt, looked like the remains of a swivel gun. Fiona found what appeared to be a battered figurehead near the bow, a carved piece of wood so worn it was impossible to tell what it once depicted. The shape might have been a dragon or a coiling serpent. Nate tapped my shoulder, motioning to the starboard side. There, half buried, was a large hole in the hull, likely from a cannon blast. My pulse quickened. This could be it, the lost pirate brig that met its doom centuries ago. Suddenly, a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision drew my attention. I swung my flashlight. Nothing there but drifting silt. An odd pulse seemed to vibrate through the water, though it might have been my imagination or a passing current. Nevertheless, a strange unease settled over me. We surfaced after about 40 minutes, all of us buzzing with excitement. Caroline couldn't shut up about the possible insignia on that broken swivel gun. Fiona speculated about the figurehead's origin. Nate rubbed the salt from his eyes and said there was likely plenty more under that sand. But as we pulled ourselves back onto the boat, I noticed something odd. The sky had taken on a peculiar hue, a bruise-colored twilight that seemed too dark for the hour. My dive watch read 2 p.m., yet the sunlight appeared dim, filtered through a haze I hadn't seen earlier. A hush fell over the water, as if the wind had died down. A chill scuttled across my neck. I glanced at Nate, who gave me a shrug. "Weather changes fast here," he said, but his voice hinted at unease. We radioed in our initial findings and decided we'd return early next morning to begin the careful process of excavation. That night, the four of us sprawled in the boathouse, nibbling on convenience store snacks and reviewing the underwater footage. The images were grainy, but they confirmed the presence of cannons, rotting cargo crates, and an odd arrangement of bones, likely fish or sea turtles, though none of us were sure. Around midnight, Caroline yawned and called it a night. Fiona left soon after. Nate and I lingered, sipping stale coffee, discussing the day's discoveries. He cracked a joke about cursed gold, and we both laughed, but uneasily. When I finally shut off the lights and stepped outside to head home, I heard something, like distant thunder, except the sky was clear now. The echo seemed to roll in from the harbor. A single boom that rattled my nerves. I tried telling myself it was a cargo ship or a far-off storm. But deep down, I remembered the stories of cannon fire. We planned a methodical excavation, setting up a grid over the wreck site with weighted lines, carefully removing silt to expose artifacts. The next morning, the weather was calm, the sun bright. It felt like the city had pressed a reset button after yesterday's ominous twilight. Underwater, we worked with plastic trowels and brushes, moving slowly so we didn't cloud the water with silt. I pried away layers of sand near the forward hatch, revealing a corroded ring that might have once been a cargo hold latch. Fiona and Caroline focused on mapping the deck layout. Nate swam around the perimeter, checking the hull stability. Despite the calm weather topside, the water felt restless. A series of gentle surges kept nudging us away from the wreck, almost like the sea itself was trying to push us back. At one point, my regulator felt tight, my breathing coming faster than usual. I paused, forced myself to relax. Then, as if conjured from the gloom, a shape drifted into view, a piece of tattered cloth caught on a splintered plank. It might have been part of a sail or a banner. I reached to free it, feeling its rough texture under my gloves. For a moment, it seemed to move on its own, curling around my wrist. I jerked back, heart hammering. The cloth tore away, floating upward. I thought I saw a pattern on it, a skull, or maybe just a stain. My mind might have been playing tricks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it had once been a pirate flag. After surfacing and resting on the boat, we decided to lower a small airlift dredge to help remove the heavier sand. By late afternoon, we'd uncovered more of the deck. Our biggest discovery was a partially intact captain's cabin. The door was stuck, jammed by centuries of coral growth, so we carefully pried it open. Caroline was the first to shine her flashlight in. I was right behind her. The cabin was cramped, littered with shattered furniture. Papers had dissolved into pulp ages ago, but a rusted metal chest sat wedged against the bulkhead. My heart soared at the thought of what might be inside: valuables, logbooks, who knew? We spent the next half hour chipping away the encrusted layers. When we finally opened the chest, we found bones. Human bones. A skull and a scattering of ribs, bound with rusted chains. Caroline let out a gasp through her regulator. I could only stare, my stomach churning. Fiona joined us, wide-eyed. The chain snaked around the remains, attached to a metal ring on the inside of the chest. Whoever this was, they'd been locked in here, buried at sea with the ship. Nate swam closer, shining his dive light on the skull. A scrap of cloth still clung to it, revealing a tuft of hair. I had the irrational sense that this poor soul was glaring at me, black eye sockets brimming with centuries of rage. Suddenly, the water temperature seemed to plummet. My teeth chattered. I signaled for us to ascend. That evening, we returned to the boathouse shaken. The skeleton in the chest suggested a grim story, perhaps a prisoner or a traitorous crew member. Caroline, normally upbeat, was pale and silent. Fiona flipped through her notes with trembling fingers. Nate paced, chewing the inside of his cheek. I tried to focus on the next steps, contacting forensic specialists, documenting the remains properly. Yet all I could think about was that chest. The chain. The black hollows of the skull. As night fell, a thick fog rolled in from the harbor, blanketing the water in ghostly vapor. We stepped outside to gather some fresh air, only to be greeted by the distant glow of lights dancing across the bay, the same lights I'd seen before. They flickered in and out of the mist, accompanied by faint booms that made my chest tighten. Caroline grabbed my arm. Are those fireworks, or something else? Nate clenched his jaw. Doesn't sound like fireworks to me. Then, as if in answer, a faraway splash carried across the water, followed by an echo that made my skin crawl, like men shouting, though muffled by time and fog. We exchanged looks. No one said a word. But I could read the fear in their eyes. The harbor was restless, and we were meddling with something older and darker than we knew. None of us slept well. I dozed off at 2 a.m. in the boathouse bunk room, only to jolt awake to the sound of scraping metal. The hair on my neck stood on end as I flicked on my flashlight. The room was empty except for me, the walls lined with diving equipment. At first, I thought it was a dream. Then I heard it again, metal dragging against concrete. Hard hammering, I tiptoed out of the bunk room and into the corridor. A single light bulb flickered overhead. Shapes loomed in the gloom, stacked crates, coiled ropes, oxygen tanks. Nothing moved. Yet the scraping continued, coming from around the corner. Slowly, I crept forward, sweat prickling my forehead. I saw a large anchor chain we'd salvaged from a different wreck lying on the floor. Normally, it was coiled neatly. Now, it stretched across the concrete, links rattling as though pulled by an invisible hand. I froze. My flashlight flickered. With a clang, the chain stopped moving, collapsing into a limp heap. My breath came in ragged gulps. Then footsteps pounded behind me, Nate, armed with a tire iron. Matt? You okay? I pointed at the chain, speechless. He stared at it, then at me. After a tense moment, he shook his head. Maybe it slipped off the crate. We both knew that made no sense. But we couldn't stand there all night, paralyzed. Nate gently replaced the chain, and we returned to the bunk room. I didn't sleep another minute. At dawn, Caroline revealed she'd received a phone call around 4 a.m., some local fisherman, an old-timer who claimed to know the site of our wreck. He told me we were stirring up the devil's water, she said, eyes rimmed with fatigue. Said people hear cannon fire whenever the spirits are restless. Fiona rubbed her temple. So now locals are calling us, warning us off? Guess the rumor mill is churning, Nate muttered. I felt a flicker of doubt. Should we continue? Something about this project had become wrong. But the rational side of me was stubborn. We were scientists, historians. There had to be a logical explanation for the weirdness, the lights, the noises, the chain. So we pressed on. Back at the wreck, we tried to document the skeleton in the chest more thoroughly. The water visibility had worsened, though, stirring with silt. Oddly enough, the ocean felt colder than the day before, as if a frigid current had swept in overnight. We donned thicker wetsuits. After setting up our underwater lights, we carefully extracted the bones from the chest. Caroline snapped photos. Fiona pointed out the broken teeth, the slash marks on the rib cage. This was no peaceful death. Nate hovered near the hatch, keeping watch. I felt each second drag. An oppressive weight pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe, like the water itself was heavier. At one point, Caroline tapped my arm and gestured to the silt just beyond the chest. Something was carved into the wood of the cabin floor. We brushed away layers of sediment, revealing a single word, etched in a jagged scrawl, cursed. I practically heard my heart beating in my ears. Caroline's eyes met mine, wide as the moon. This was no random graffiti. Someone had carved that word centuries ago, maybe in the last moments before the ship went under. Then, from deeper in the wreck, a flash of movement. A swirl of silt. Nate whipped his flashlight around. Nothing. But we all felt it, a presence lurking just beyond our lights. By the time we surfaced, the sky was overcast, the wind picking up. Waves rocked our dive boat. Over the radio, we heard warnings of a sudden squall heading our way. We needed to pack up and head back, fast. As I hauled the last bit of gear on board, a wave splashed across my feet. I tensed, half expecting a rotted hand to latch onto my ankle. My nerves were raw. On the horizon, lightning flashed. Thunder rumbled. Charleston's harbor seemed to brood, the waters dark as ink. We motored back in tense silence, the radio static hissing like a malevolent whisper. Once ashore, we secured our equipment in the boathouse just as the first sheets of rain lashed down. Caroline carefully placed a bag containing the skeletal remains on a steel table in the corner. Protocol demanded a thorough analysis, along with contacting the coroner's office for possible historical remains. But it was a strange feeling, laying centuries-old bones on a modern metal table while thunder boomed outside. None of us spoke. A heavy sense of dread coated the air, the same way the storm coated the streets in rain. The storm that night was brutal, torrential downpours, wind howling like a wounded animal, lightning painting the sky a sickly yellow. The boathouse rattled with each gust, water seeping in under the doors. We lost power around 9 p.m., leaving us in flickering candlelight and the glow of a single battery lantern. Fiona tried reading 18th century documents by candlelight, searching for any mention of Avery's last stand. Caroline sat cross-legged on a bench, eyes closed, lips pressed in a worried line. Nate paced. I stared at the bag of bones, trying not to think about that etched word, cursed. Around midnight, the wind slammed something against the boathouse with a metallic crash. We all jumped. Nate grabbed a flashlight and opened the door a crack, letting in a burst of rain and wind. Lightning illuminated the harbor behind him, revealing a silhouette that made my blood freeze, a tall, ragged figure standing at the water's edge. The flash was gone in an instant, and the figure vanished with it. Nate jerked back inside, slamming the door. He looked rattled but said nothing. We secured the lock and huddled around the lantern. Then it started, banging on the walls, faint at first, as if someone outside was knocking with bare knuckles. Caroline whimpered. Fiona's face was pale. Thunder drowned out the noise for a moment, then it returned, rapid, insistent thud, 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 circling the boathouse. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. My breath turned to vapor in the lantern light. Fiona's teeth chattered. Then, suddenly, silence. A moment later, the lantern fizzed out, plunging us into darkness. I fumbled for a flashlight, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Another lightning flash outside revealed the silhouettes of my colleagues, wide-eyed shadows in the gloom. Then something slammed into the door, rattling the hinges. We heard would splinter. Fiona screamed. Nate rushed forward, bracing the door with his shoulder, struggling to keep it shut. The storm roared, water seeping through the crack. A voice hissed through the gap, low and guttural. I couldn't understand the words, but they made my blood run cold. It sounded like a curse in archaic English, laced with fury. Then, just as quickly, the pressure vanished. Nate staggered back, and the door stayed closed. All we heard was the relentless hammering of rain. I shone the flashlight around. The bag of bones. It was gone. My stomach lurched. Caroline stammered, What? Where? We all frantically searched the boathouse. No sign of the skeleton. The steel table stood empty. A trail of wet footprints led from the table to the corner, then vanished into a puddle. How could a pile of bones just walk away? We decided we couldn't stay another minute in that cursed building. Nate wanted to drive to the police station or maybe a church, anywhere but there. Fiona grabbed her purse. Caroline clung to my arm. The wind still howled, but we braced ourselves and flung open the door. Sheets of rain stung our faces, lightning splitting the sky. We trudged through ankle-deep water in the courtyard behind the boathouse. Overhead, wind whipped the palm trees into frantic shapes. We were halfway to our parked SUV when a flash of lightning revealed a terrifying sight, figures standing near the shoreline, 8 or 9 of them, clad in dripping rags, their faces obscured by shadows. They seemed to shimmer, as if not fully solid. My heart slammed in my chest. Caroline gasped. Fiona murmured a prayer. Nate raised a shaky hand, as though to ward them off. One of the figures stepped forward, lightning illuminating a skeletal face. Tattered pirate garb clung to rotted flesh, a tricorner hat perched askew. Beneath the hat, 2 hollow eye sockets stared straight at us. For an instant, the storm went silent in my ears. Then the figure lifted a rusted flintlock pistol, pointing it at us. No bullet could remain after centuries, but I still ducked, expecting the worst. A deafening crack of thunder shook the world. When the lightning flashed again, the figures had moved closer, impossibly fast, their skeletal hands reaching out. Nate shouted, "Go!" We sprinted to the SUV. I fumbled with the keys. Something cold grazed my shoulder, a half-glimpsed hand trying to grab me. I kicked out, connected with what felt like soggy cloth and bone. A guttural hiss pierced the air. Finally, the door unlocked, and we piled in, slamming it behind us. I gunned the engine, tires skidding on flooded pavement. In the rearview mirror, I saw those phantoms standing there in the torrent of rain, glaring after us with glowing eyes. We tore through Charleston streets, water splashing up around our wheels. The storm raged so violently that I could barely see. Streetlights flickered, some dead, others strobing in and out of existence. We passed shuttered storefronts and colonial mansions hidden behind sheets of rain. Caroline sobbed quietly in the back seat. Fiona clutched the dashboard, knuckles white. Nate muttered curses under his breath, shaking his head as if trying to dispel a nightmare. I had no idea where to go. I just knew I had to keep driving, put distance between us and those things. Every corner seemed alien, street names half lost under churning water. The city that once felt so welcoming now felt labyrinthine and hostile. At last, we spotted a flicker of neon, a small diner that seemed to have power. I screeched to a halt in the lot, water cascading off the hood. We dashed inside, sopping wet and out of breath. A lone waitress stood behind the counter, eyes wide at our appearance. "Lord have mercy, y'all look like you've seen a ghost," she said with genuine concern. Nobody answered. We collapsed into a booth, hearts pounding. Over lukewarm coffee, we tried to piece together a plan. The diner's TV sputtered with emergency weather alerts, but the news anchor didn't mention anything about ghostly pirate crews. Nate insisted we do something about the wreck. We found that skeleton, maybe we triggered something. We woke them up. Caroline nodded shakily. All those stories about cannon fire, lights on the water. It's them, the pirates. They're restless. They want revenge. I buried my face in my hands, thinking of the carved word cursed. What if they're bound to the site of the wreck somehow, and by removing the bones, we messed with their eternal prison? Fiona cleared her throat. There's an old maritime legend. If a cursed crew is chained to a sunken ship, disturbing their remains releases them. They'll haunt the living until someone returns what was taken or destroys it properly. We all stared at her. So we have to return the skeleton? I asked, voice hollow. She shrugged, eyes darting nervously. Either that, or lay them to rest in consecrated ground. I don't know. The legends vary. Caroline leaned across the table. So if we bring the bones to a churchyard? Give them a proper burial? Nate frowned. We don't even have the bones anymore. They walked off. Silence. The rain hammered the diner's roof, thunder rolling in the distance. My mind spun. The skeleton had literally vanished, presumably animated by some unholy force. Then my phone buzzed, startling us all. I picked it up. A single text message from an unknown number, meet at the harbor 3 a.m. You must return what you stole. My blood ran cold. It was almost 2:30 a.m. The storm eased to a steady downpour, and we realized we had little choice. These ghosts, or whatever they were, meant business. If we refused, who knew what horrors might be unleashed on Charleston or on us? We paid the waitress, who probably thought we were insane, and raced back to the boathouse. Cautiously, we entered, flashlights scanning the dim interior. Water dripped from the ceiling. The chain on the floor lay in a tangled heap, unmoving. At first, we saw no sign of the skeleton. Then we heard a wet shuffle near the back room. Carefully, we edged toward the sound. Our flashlight beams revealed a horrifying sight, the skeletal form crouched in the corner, chain still wrapped around its ribcage. It turned its hollow gaze on us, jaw slack, water dripping from the dark cavities. My heart nearly stopped. Nate hefted a crowbar, just in case. Fiona and Caroline clung to each other. The skeleton rose, and behind it, shapes materialized, phantom pirates fading into view. Their bodies glistened with seaweed, clothes tattered, eyes gleaming with spectral light. The stench of decay and brine choked the air. A tall figure stepped forward, face half rotted, wearing a threadbare captain's coat. He hissed, "Ye took our bones from the deep. Now, bring them back, or Charleston's blood shall run." My mind whirled. We'll return the remains. We only wanted to study. The captain bared a skeletal grin. No talk. Act. The tide waits for no soul. Lightning flashed outside. The skeleton in the corner creaked and clattered its jaw, as if beckoning us. We realized we had no choice. Carefully, we hoisted the soggy bones, still wrapped in the chain, and carried them out to our SUV under the pirates' watchful gaze. They followed like a pack of silent wraiths, trudging through puddles and wet grass. We drove to the harbor in tense silence, the spectral crew drifting behind us, or maybe within the gloom that clung to the city. By the time we reached the shore, it was close to 3 a.m. We boarded our dive boat once more, despite the creeping dread. The water lay eerily calm now, as if the storm had exhausted itself. Dark clouds still hung overhead, blocking the moon. Nate started the engine, while Fiona and Caroline clutched the bundled skeleton. I shone a flashlight around, half expecting to see more ghosts on the boat's deck. But the apparitions seemed content to watch from the shoreline, their glowing eyes like candles in the dark. When we reached the wreck site, the waves were oddly still. I peered into the water. A faint, unnatural light glowed beneath the surface, illuminating the rotted hull. We prepared our gear, hearts pounding. This time, Fiona and Caroline would wait on the boat, only Nate and I would descend. We had the skeleton, chained to a weighted crate to keep it from drifting away. Nate and I exchanged a grim nod. Then we plunged into the black water. As we descended, the glow intensified, forming a pale ring around the wreck. The skeleton felt heavier than any cargo I'd ever carried, like it contained the weight of centuries of sin. My gut twisted. We landed on the deck, stirring silt. The eerie glow made the water shimmer, revealing swirling shapes at the edges of my vision, phantoms of the dead crew, drifting behind the veil. My ears rang with a strange hum, as if the ocean itself sang a dirge. Nate pointed to a hole in the deck, a hatch leading into the captain's cabin. That's where we'd found the chest, where this body had been chained. We carefully maneuvered the skeleton inside. The cabin felt tighter now, as though the walls had closed in. I set the weighted crate down in the same spot we'd found the chest. My head spun with fear. Suddenly, a swirl of glowing shapes filled the cabin, ghostly arms, twisted faces, silent screams. I staggered. Nate grabbed my arm before I could drop the skeleton. With trembling hands, we placed the bones on the floorboards. The water vibrated, a deep rumble echoing through the wreck. Bubbles escaped my regulator in a rush. The skeleton twitched. Its jaw clicked open and shut, releasing a cloud of silt. Then the chain slithered across the deck, wrapping around a rotted beam. I swear I heard faint laughter in the water, echoing off the timbers. Nate gestured frantically for us to ascend, now. We kicked upward, hearts thudding. As we rose, the cabin behind us flickered with spectral light. The last thing I saw was the skeleton's skull tilting upward, empty sockets locked on me. Breaking the surface, we gasped for air, though we still had regulators in our mouths. Caroline and Fiona helped us onto the boat, eyes wide with worry. I stripped off my mask, adrenaline pumping. A strange hush enveloped the night. The harbor was dark, no sign of those flickering lights. The watery horizon lay still. It was as if the storm and the ghosts had vanished in unison, leaving behind an oppressive silence. We started the engine, returning to shore as dawn lightened the eastern sky. Upon landing, we glanced around for the phantom crew. No one emerged from the mist. The city slept in the early morning gloom, unaware of the horrors that had just played out. Exhausted, we collapsed in the boathouse. The chain lay motionless on the floor, exactly where we'd left it. No footprints, no apparitions. It was all gone, as if it never happened, except for our racing hearts and the taste of salt on our lips. Story number 3. I've been a journalist for 15 years, chasing stories that danced on the line between truth and myth. My friends call me stubborn, but I prefer persistent. I guess that same persistence is what sent me straight into the heart of the Bermuda Triangle, searching for answers I've never stopped craving. My name is Wes Hendricks, and as I sit here writing this, I'm still struggling to process what happened to me and my crew when we boarded that ghost ship. It started with a phone call in the middle of the night. My editor at the online investigative magazine, Global Aperture, woke me up at 3 a.m. with a single, breathless question: "Do you want the story of a lifetime?" That question hooked me before my groggy brain could protest. Even half asleep, the lure of an exclusive, something big, stirred my adrenaline. I said yes, as I always do. My editor, Perry, said, "Pack a bag for Florida. I'll brief you on the way." By dawn, I was on a flight to Miami. Perry's emails came in a flurry of frantic text and attached photos. A towering cruise liner called the Majestic Wanderer, built in the late 1960s, vanished in the Bermuda Triangle in 1972 with over 400 souls on board. It was one of those classic unsolved mysteries people like to pin on everything from aliens to wormholes. But now, in 2025, the ship had apparently reappeared, drifting aimlessly off the Florida coast, empty as an abandoned tomb. The Coast Guard found her listing in calm waters and boarded to render assistance, only to discover no trace of any passenger or crew. Some surfaces still had fresh drops of condensation, as if someone had been breathing in those corridors moments before. But no bodies, no signs of life. It was as if the entire complement of staff and travelers had evaporated. The ship itself looked ancient, battered by decades of storms and the relentless ocean, yet weirdly intact in places. One unconfirmed rumor even claimed a table in the dining hall was set for dinner, napkins folded, plates in place. I read those details with a growing tightness in my chest, excitement wrestling with dread. This was impossible, right? But the photos Perry sent were real enough, the faded name on the hull, the peeling paint that matched old archival images of the Majestic Wanderer, the golden script still legible beneath layers of rust. By the time I landed, I was half convinced this was an elaborate hoax. That skepticism bled away when I saw the Majestic Wanderer with my own eyes. We chartered a small press boat out of Key Biscayne, weaving through turquoise waters under a blazing Florida sun. After an hour, there she was, an enormous silhouette looming on the horizon, black hull crusted with barnacles, upper decks covered in a tangled web of rust. My breath caught in my throat. It was too real, too impossible, too big. My investigative team joined me on that boat. Dana Pearson, our photographer and the bravest soul I've ever met. Marcus Cho, a videographer who doubled as our tech wizard. Shayla Reyes, another reporter who specialized in maritime history and had an encyclopedic knowledge of all things lost at sea. We chugged closer to the drifting behemoth, our small vessel bobbing in its looming shadow. The Coast Guard had already set up a perimeter, but the radio chatter suggested confusion rather than lockdown. A handful of official ships circled at a distance, as if they feared getting too close. Marcus was on his phone, listening to some feed from the harbor patrol, shaking his head as he said, "They're not sure if this is a crime scene or a ghost story." When we were within a couple 100 feet of the hull, I stared up at the corroded letters, MAJESTICWANDERER. I shuddered. History had come to life in the form of a rotting, silent monstrosity. The sea around her was unnaturally calm, like the entire Atlantic was holding its breath for us. A Coast Guard official tried to wave us off. We flashed our press credentials, hollering that we had permission from higher-ups to at least get a look. He grudgingly let us motor alongside, but made us promise not to wander off alone. That was a promise we didn't intend to keep. We were here for answers. Shayla roped us to the side hatch, the same entry the Coast Guard used earlier. We climbed a steel ladder up a few feet to a battered door. One of the coasties offered us face masks, just in case of mold or pathogens, he said, his eyes anxious. Then he pointed his flashlight into a hallway. "It's empty. Don't get lost." We stepped aboard, flashlights at the ready, hearts pounding. I felt like we were entering a crypt. The corridor was narrow, lined with peeling floral wallpaper from the 1970s. The floor was carpeted, damp and foul-smelling, water-stained in many places. The air was stale, with a tang of salt and mildew. We flicked on our headlamps. Dana snapped photos of every inch, her camera shutter echoing like a distant heartbeat. I tried to wrap my head around the logistics. The ship was rumored lost in 1972, yet it now emerged more than 50 years later, looking simultaneously ancient and bizarrely preserved. Some overhead lights were out, but others flickered with half-dead bulbs. That alone shouldn't have been possible, not after all this time. We made our way past what might have once been a bustling reception area. A giant desk sat skewed, covered in debris. Behind it, an old sign read "Welcome aboard the Majestic Wanderer" in faded gold letters. A pamphlet rack lay toppled, its brochures melted into paper mush. Dana crouched to snap close-ups of the disintegrated tickets, some dated July 1972. We pressed farther. The hush was surreal. Every step felt like trespassing on sacred ground. The ship's corridors were a labyrinth, but Shayla had a partial layout from old archives. She guided us toward the main dining hall, hoping to confirm the rumor about the table set for dinner. I scanned the walls, half expecting to see moldy posters of go-go dancers or Elvis tributes, but everything was stripped or rotted away. In some places, water dripped from overhead piping, creating puddles that reflected our flashlights. My stomach clenched with every corridor. I kept imagining hearing footsteps behind us, but whenever I spun around, there was just emptiness. The only sounds were our breaths and the distant creaking of metal. After turning a final corner, we reached the dining hall's towering double doors. They hung askew on rusted hinges. Shayla paused, gave me a tense look, then pushed them open. The hall was cavernous. Enormous windows lined the port side, letting in pale sunlight. Tables dotted the space in neat rows, many of them overturned or coated in layers of grime. Chairs lay scattered, some broken. The once-ornate chandeliers overhead were now skeletal frames draped with cobwebs. And near the center, we saw it, a long table set with plates, silverware, and folded napkins. Just one table, clean as if waiting for guests. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. Dana whispered, "No way," as she slowly approached, camera up. The plates were old-fashioned china with gold trim, the kind you'd expect in a 1970s luxury liner. The napkins were crisp white linen, folded in a neat triangle. They looked brand new. No dust, no mold, no sign of wear. My flashlight revealed no footprints or smears around the table, as if it had materialized out of nowhere. Marcus aimed his video camera, panning across the scene. Shayla reached out to touch a fork, then snatched her hand back. "It's cold," she said. So cold it burned my finger. We all stared at her in confusion. The room's temperature was stifling, so how could metal feel icy? I pressed my fingers to one of the plates. Sure enough, a chill shot through my skin, making me yank my hand away. A drip of water splashed from the ceiling onto a spoon, startling us. That splash echoed in the silent hall. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a mirror across the room. My eyes were wide, face drawn, hair damp with sweat. I looked like a ghost. Something about this place felt deeply wrong, as though we were intruding on a realm that didn't belong in our timeline. Dana snapped a few more pictures, and her camera made a sudden whirring sound. She cursed. "My battery is draining too fast. Just replaced it an hour ago." Marcus's camera beeped, displaying a low battery warning too. Devices don't usually die that quickly, especially not brand new gear. Something was messing with the electronics, that much was obvious. Shayla said, "Okay, let's get out of here before our equipment goes kaput." I agreed, though part of me wanted to keep investigating. We retraced our steps, planning to circle back to the main corridor and then head for the bridge. We wanted to see if the ship's logs were intact, or maybe find some clue about what happened to the passengers. We turned down the corridor leading to the grand staircase. The walls felt closer than before. The flickering lights overhead cast shifting shadows. My heart kicked into a higher gear when I realized the hallway seemed longer. I tried to ignore the sense of disorientation, but after a minute of walking, we still didn't reach the staircase we'd passed earlier. Marcus said, "We must have made a wrong turn." But Shayla insisted she followed the same route. We reached a junction that didn't exist on the ship's map. A dead-end branch to our right. A set of double doors to our left. Straight ahead was more corridor, lit by a single flickering light. I felt panic nibbling at the edges of my mind. "Let's go back the way we came," I said. We spun around, but the path behind us looked different, the walls narrower. The patterns in the carpet had changed, swirls of muted colors where once it had been a floral design. I gulped, my hands clammy on the flashlight. Dana's breath hitched. "This is insane. How can a corridor shift?" We had no good answers. Marcus tried to pull up a digital map on his phone, but the screen glitched, the compass dancing wildly between directions. The battery icon plummeted to 5% in seconds, and the device shut off, dead. Shayla's phone was no better. Mine refused to even power on. The corridor was so silent now that I could hear my own pulse. Then, faintly, the lights flickered, and a sound drifted in from the darkness, a muffled chatter, like distant voices talking in unison. We froze. The voices rose, then faded, as if carried on a wind that didn't exist. I broke out in goosebumps. We pressed forward, searching for any familiar landmark. The corridor turned again, leading us to an open lounge area we hadn't seen before. The furniture looked newer, not half-rotted, with bright upholstery that must have been standard for the early 70s. The overhead lighting was fully functional here, bathing the area in a warm, yellowish glow. Soft music drifted from hidden speakers. A delicate instrumental piece that made me think of old-time cocktail parties. For a moment, I dared to believe we'd stepped back in time. The lounge wasn't vacant. Silhouettes of people stood there, ghostly, dressed in vintage clothing. A woman in a floral dress. A man in a white-collared shirt and flared pants. They flickered at the edges, not quite real. My heart thudded like a drum when one of them turned to us, mouth moving in silent conversation. Dana whispered, "Are you seeing this?" We all nodded, eyes locked on the apparitions. They carried drinks, gestured to each other, laughed, but no sound emerged. The lounge around them, from the plush carpet to the polished bar, looked as fresh as it might have in 1972. Shayla stepped closer, but the scene wavered, like a mirage on hot asphalt. The figures glitched. 1 second they were solid, the next they were shimmering outlines. My breath caught in my throat. Then the music warped, slowing to a distorted moan before cutting out entirely. The lights blinked and dimmed, plunging the lounge into shadow. When they flickered back, the lounge was again the decaying ruin of the present, no sign of the ghosts or their party. Marcus swore under his breath. Shayla trembled, tears shining in her eyes. I felt a surge of protective instinct for my team. We had to get out. Whatever was happening on this ship was beyond anything logical. We fled that lounge, stumbling through corridors that twisted in ways that defied the ship's original layout. Doors led to random rooms or to nowhere. We found a staircase that looped back onto itself, like an optical illusion. The walls pulsed with an unsettling hum that vibrated through my bones. Time felt meaningless. We had no idea how long we'd wandered. When we finally emerged into a wide foyer, we saw a cracked sign that read the Majestic Theater. A pair of ornate wooden doors, carved with seashell motifs, stood before us. They seemed as good a landmark as any. We rushed in, hoping it might connect to a more familiar part of the vessel. Inside, rows of red velvet seats faced a stage with a dusty curtain. The air was stale, smelling of old fabric and something sour. Our flashlights swept over rows of seats, revealing scattered brochures about stage shows. One seat was flipped open, and on it lay a single high-heeled shoe, still glossy black. No sign of its owner. We edged down the aisle. The stage area was wide, a place that once hosted comedic acts, magic shows, maybe dinner cabarets. Behind the thick curtain, a cluster of stage props waited in the darkness. Dana snapped pictures. Marcus tried to film, but the camera battery blinked red, close to dying. He cursed again, rummaging in his pack for a spare, which also read as drained. A low, scraping sound echoed from behind the curtain. We froze, exchanging alarmed glances. Shayla mouthed, "What was that?" None of us had an answer. I motioned for quiet. My pulse hammered in my ears. We crept closer. The scraping continued, methodical, like someone dragging metal across wood. Every hair on my arm stood on end. I peeked around the edge of the curtain, shining my flashlight onto the stage floor. A single figure crouched there, wearing tattered remains of a uniform, maybe a ship steward or crew member. Their back was turned to me, head bent low, arms moving in slow, jerky motions. The uniform hung in damp, rotted tatters around a gaunt frame. I swallowed hard and whispered, "Hello?" The figure froze, then tilted its head as though listening. I saw no hair, no normal flesh, just an odd, sallow coloration. Slowly, the figure turned to face us. The reflection of my flashlight revealed empty eye sockets and a skull-like face, with bits of dried skin clinging to bone. The jaw hung open, and in its hands was a large shard of broken metal. My scream lodged in my throat. The thing hissed, a wet, rattling sound that sent us reeling backward. Dana let out a choked gasp. The figure lurched to its feet, dropping the metal shard with a clang that echoed through the theater. When it moved, I glimpsed the outlines of a crew name tag dangling from a rotted lanyard. My flashlight flickered again, stuttering with the same interference plaguing our electronics. The figure took a step closer, mouth gaping wider, an unearthly moan escaping its throat. Instinct overrode curiosity. We ran, stumbling down the aisle toward the exit. The figure shrieked behind us, a nightmarish wail that vibrated in my skull. We burst through the theater doors, slamming them shut. I heard the creature pound on the other side, wood cracking. Then the corridor lurched again, like the floor was rolling on a storm-tossed sea. A wave of vertigo washed over me. Dana shouted, "Look!" She pointed down the corridor. At the far end, light streamed in from an open hatch. Daylight. Could it be our way out? We bolted for it, ignoring the monstrous noises behind us. Everything blurred, the corridor seemed to stretch and contract. I focused on that rectangle of white light, the promise of escape. When we reached it, we realized it was some kind of cargo door opening to the outside deck. Blinding sunshine poured in, stinging our eyes. We spilled out onto the deck, gasping for air. The shift from stale gloom to bright sun was disorienting. My watch read 4:10 p.m., but the sun overhead felt like midday. We scanned the horizon for the Coast Guard ships, for our own press boat. Nothing. The ocean around us was empty except for endless sparkling waves. Confusion clutched at my mind. Where the hell are they? I muttered. Marcus leaned over the deck railing, searching for any sign of land. There was nothing. No Florida coast, no perimeter ships, no sign of humanity. Just a boundless sea stretching in every direction. A wave of terror seized me. Had the ship moved? Or had we passed into some other dimension? Shayla sank to her knees, tears in her eyes. This can't be real. Dana tried the walkie-talkie we'd used earlier to contact the Coast Guard. All we got was static. We flicked through channels, calling for help, but there was no response. Even the sky looked different, cloudless, a sharper shade of blue, the sun too high for late afternoon. We staggered along the deck, hoping to find a lifeboat or a radio tower that worked. The metal underfoot was scorching. We found a lifeboat station, but the boats were gone or rotted away, the pulleys rusted to uselessness. A raised deck toward the stern housed what looked like a radio room, so we forced our way in. Inside, ancient equipment lined the walls, dials, levers, a microphone. The console lights glowed faintly, unbelievably. Marcus tried every switch, messing with the frequency knobs. At first, static hissed. Then we heard faint voices, garbled nonsense that sounded like it might be in multiple languages. A swirl of radio signals all bleeding together, overlapping in a cacophony. Dana leaned into the microphone, calling for help, giving coordinates we'd known earlier. She repeated our boat's name, our press credentials, everything. Nothing but jumbled replies or bursts of harsh static. Sweat dripped down my face. The air was stifling. It felt like the entire ship was afloat in a bubble outside normal reality. My chest ached with dread. We had to do something, but we had no plan, no resources. Even water was in short supply if we couldn't find the galley. But would the galley even be in its original location now, or had everything shifted again? Marcus yanked away from the controls in frustration. "This is useless," he said, voice trembling. "We're stuck." That was when we heard footsteps overhead. Slow, measured steps crossing the deck above. We froze. Shayla jerked her head up, eyes wide. Maybe the Coast Guard had found us? But the footsteps were methodical, heavy, and we sensed that they were not friendly. I mouthed, quiet, and motioned for us to move. We crept out of the radio room and climbed a narrow stairwell to the top deck. Each rung squeaked beneath us. The footsteps grew louder until we emerged onto the deck in the scorching sun. At first, I didn't see anyone, just a few bleached deck chairs and a rusted railing. Then a tall figure came into view around the corner of the smokestack. It wore a uniform reminiscent of an old-time captain or senior officer, though half of it was missing, the cloth tattered. The figure's face was concealed by a mop of hair, stringy and dark. Slowly, it lifted its head, revealing hollow, sunken eyes in a leathery face. Its lips peeled back into a grin that exposed rotted teeth. My mind screamed to run, but my feet refused. The figure spoke in a rasping voice, "You shouldn't have come here." The accent was old-fashioned, each syllable labored. Shayla squeaked in terror. Dana raised her camera on instinct, snapping a photo. The flash made the figure snarl. I braced myself to run again, but the figure took a staggering step toward us. "The sea doesn't let go," it croaked. "We're all lost." "You are lost." It reached out a bony hand, fingers curled like talons. A powerful wave of dizziness crashed over me. The sun above seemed to spin, the deck tilting. Dana screamed as her camera blinked off. Marcus shouted something I couldn't parse. The figure's laughter echoed in my ears, ragged and triumphant. Then everything went black. I don't know how long I was out. Could have been seconds, minutes, hours. When I came to, I was lying on the deck, the sun lower in the sky now, painting everything in a golden haze. Dana, Marcus, and Shayla were sprawled nearby, groaning as they stirred. The figure was gone. My mouth tasted of copper. A throbbing pain pulsed at my temple. We exchanged frightened looks. Marcus's voice wavered as he said, "Wes, we need to get inside, get water." None of us wanted to go back into that labyrinth of corridors, but dehydration would kill us faster than ghosts if we stayed in the heat. We descended to the lower decks, moving in a disoriented haze. The corridors again changed. Some places looked normal, others were warped. We passed by sections lit by flickering fluorescent lights that shouldn't have been powered. We glimpsed reflections of ourselves in mirrored walls, only to see the reflections linger a fraction of a second too long, as if they had a life of their own. Eventually, we found a door labeled Crew Galley. Inside, a row of refrigerators and cabinets lined the wall. The stench of rotted food hit us like a punch. Half the space was coated in mold. Yet near the far end, bizarrely, there was a single cooler plugged into a power outlet. A faint hum indicated it was running. With shaky hands, Shayla opened it. Inside were water bottles, apparently fresh. We gawked in disbelief, half expecting them to vanish. We each took one, uncapping them carefully. The water tasted normal, no salty tang or foul odor. Gratitude flooded my system, at least we wouldn't die of thirst today. But the very existence of fresh water here, in an otherwise rotting galley, only emphasized how unnatural this place was. A loud clang made us jump. We turned to see the door slammed shut by itself, the latch clicking. Marcus rushed to open it, but the handle wouldn't budge. "It's locked," he muttered, panic creeping into his voice. From the outside? We were trapped in the galley. A muffled groan emerged from the corridor, followed by scratching sounds along the metal door. I flashed back to the creature in the theater, the trailing uniform, the empty eye sockets. My breath shortened. The scratching intensified, nails raking across steel. The door started to warp, dents forming from the other side. Shayla whimpered, pressing herself against the far wall. Dana grabbed a kitchen knife from a nearby drawer, her knuckles white. I fumbled for anything that could help, maybe a fire extinguisher or a metal rod. Suddenly, the noise ceased. An eerie silence replaced it. We waited, hearts pounding. The door handle rattled once more, then stopped. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the lights in the galley flickered, turning the shadows into dancing monsters. Marcus found a utility hatch in the floor, probably leading to a service passage. We pried it open, shining a flashlight into the dark space below. A ladder led down into gloom. We could hear water dripping, echoing up the shaft. I hesitated, but better to face the unknown below than wait for the ghoul outside to tear down the door. One by one, we climbed down. The metal rungs were slick, forcing caution with every step. The air grew colder the deeper we went, a damp chill that clung to my skin. At the bottom, we found ourselves in a cramped corridor of pipes and valves, the ship's mechanical underbelly. Our flashlights revealed rusted turbines, twisting metal passages, a labyrinth that might lead us to the engine room or even an escape hatch. The corridor stretched in two directions. Shayla consulted the crumpled map in her pocket, which she'd taken from some earlier archive, but nothing matched this. We chose the path that sloped downward, hoping maybe we could reach the cargo hold, then access a hatch to the outside. We made our way cautiously. The clang of our footsteps echoed, each sound magnified in the silence. Water trickled from overhead pipes. A sign on the wall read Engineering Bay, letters barely legible. The door beneath that sign was slightly ajar. I peered in. Darkness swallowed the space, but a faint buzzing sound drew me in. Maybe a generator? If any part of the ship's power was still functional, we might find a radio or something to break the dimension we were stuck in. We slipped inside. Our flashlights revealed a massive engine room, rows of machinery that looked decades out of date. Pipes coiled overhead, some dripping with an oily residue. A metal walkway ringed the area, leading up to a control console. A dim green light glowed on the console, flickering like a beacon of false hope. We approached the console. The label read Transponder, Auxiliary. The text was chipped, but legible. Marcus fiddled with the switches. A tinny hum came through a dusty speaker, followed by a voice crackling in and out, "Anyone, please respond." Florida. Coast Guard, then static. My heart leapt. It's them. Marcus tried to reply, but the mic produced only squeals. The transponder panel emitted a loud pop, sparks flying. We jumped back. Thick black smoke poured from the console, filling the air with the stench of burning plastic. The last flickering light died, plunging us into darkness once more. A wave of despair crashed over me. Every lead, every hope ended in short circuits and ghosts. Shayla started sobbing, quietly at first, then with growing intensity. Dana put an arm around her, trying to soothe her while fighting tears herself. Marcus stared at the ruined console, fists clenched. I felt an overwhelming urge to scream. And that's when the lights came on again. Not the flickering overhead bulbs, but something else, a pulsing, sickly green glow emanating from deeper within the engine room. It reminded me of old radium watch dials, an unnatural luminescence. We stared, transfixed. The hum returned, rising and falling in pitch. My nerves jangled. We crept toward the glow, a horrifying magnetism drawing us in despite every instinct to flee. Beyond a tangle of pipes, in a recessed alcove, we found a large cylindrical device attached to the ship's main engine. It looked jury-rigged, a mess of wires and metal plating. The surface pulsed with that green glow. A faint symbol was etched into the metal, some geometric design I didn't recognize, circles overlapping triangles. It gave me an immediate sense of unease, like glimpsing an alien language. I had no clue what we were looking at, but Shayla, always the researcher, murmured, this might be some sort of experimental power source. Or something else. Dana swallowed. Was the majestic wanderer carrying a secret cargo? Marcus pointed out faint inscriptions on the side, mostly corroded, but I saw the word Tesla, or maybe Tessera. Hard to be sure. My flashlight flickered again, as if reacting to the device's energy. The hum grew louder. My heart pounded in sync with that pulsation. Shayla's voice trembled. What if this is the cause of everything? Time distortion, the dimension shift, the missing passengers? An experiment gone wrong? Or something not from our world? The ship's mysteries suddenly took on a terrifying new clarity. Maybe the majestic wanderer had been carrying this device in 1972, and some catastrophic event in the Bermuda Triangle caused it to warp reality. Now, in 2025, it drifted back into our waters, still infected by that twisted energy. We heard footsteps echoing again, or maybe they were just illusions. But they drove us to act. We had to do something about this machine. If it was keeping us trapped, maybe shutting it down could free us. Marcus tried to approach the contraption, but as he got closer, a surge of static electricity lashed out, striking him like a mini lightning bolt. He yelped, staggering back, arm smoking. Dana pulled him away, alarmed. He wasn't badly injured, just a burn on his forearm, but it was enough to prove the machine was dangerous. The hum rose to a fever pitch, rattling the metal walkway. Steam hissed from the pipes overhead. Lights flickered strobe-like. The entire engine room trembled. I felt weightless for a moment, my ears popping as though under rapid pressure changes. My flashlight spun beams across the walls, revealing glimpses of half-rotted corpses draped in crew uniforms, there, then gone, like a horrifying hallucination. Shayla screamed. Dana dragged Marcus behind a support column. I grabbed Shayla's arm, pulling her close as the machine crackled with arcs of green lightning. The walls seemed to melt, revealing a kaleidoscope of images, ocean waves under a starry night from some unknown year, silhouettes of airplanes from different eras, people in vintage clothing wandering aimlessly. My mind reeled. We were seeing decades, maybe centuries, swirling together in a single point. I caught a glimpse of the original passengers, their faces contorted in terror, as if lost in some timeless void. They reached out, mouths open in silent pleas. Then the vision shattered, replaced by the throbbing engine room once more. I gasped for air, my chest tight with panic. The device unleashed a final surge of green light that blasted outward. Everything flashed white. I thought I was dead. When I came to, I was sprawled on a different deck. Night had fallen, or perhaps it was just pitch black. The air was cold, the surfaces slick with condensation. My team lay nearby, unconscious. I shook them one by one, calling their names. Slowly, they roused, groaning. Dana, Marcus, Shayla. We were all still here, somehow. Above us stretched a sky of unfamiliar stars, strange constellations. No moon, no recognizable horizon. Just an endless black ocean. My watch read 9:22 p.m., but the date was flickering, resetting from 2025 to 1972 and back again. I felt no sense of time. The majestic wanderer drifted in silence, any sign of normal electronics gone. We huddled together, uncertain if we were still on Earth. The ship felt emptier, if that was possible. The corridors we glimpsed were dark, no flickering lights anymore. Just the oppressive gloom and that hum, quieter now, but still present somewhere below decks. Every once in a while, we caught a flicker of those ghosts from 1972, faces twisted in eternal shock, drifting through the walls. At some point, we dozed off from sheer exhaustion. My dreams were filled with horrifying images, a swirling vortex in the heart of the Bermuda Triangle, the device glowing, ripping holes in reality, swallowing plane after plane, boat after boat. I saw the missing passengers, their bodies stretched like taffy through dimensions. I woke with a scream lodged in my throat, covered in cold sweat. Shayla shook me gently. "There's something out on the water," she whispered. I rubbed my eyes and stood, stumbling to the rail. A faint glow pulsed in the distance, not green this time, but a pale white, like a distant searchlight. Could it be rescue? Or another trick? We couldn't stay. The ship was a death trap. We found a half-intact life raft container on the upper deck. With desperate strength, we managed to pry it open. Inside was a deflated emergency raft, decades old but still sealed. Amazingly, it inflated when we pulled the cord, though the seams creaked ominously. Without further debate, we clambered over the railing, lowering the raft onto the black water. Terrified that any second the ship might yank us back into that twisted dimension, we slid down a rope and landed in the raft. The majestic wanderer towered over us, silent except for the faint hum beneath her hull. The glow from the unknown horizon beckoned. We paddled. The raft's oars were brittle, threatening to snap, but we paddled anyway. My muscles screamed, my mind frayed with exhaustion. Behind us, the ship's silhouette faded into darkness. I kept expecting monstrous shapes to burst from the water, but we remained alone on a calm, glassy sea. At some point, I glanced at my watch, 3:45 a.m. No clue if that time meant anything now. Hours later, or maybe an eternity, we saw real daylight creeping over the horizon. The water had changed from black to normal Atlantic blue. My watch read 6:10 a.m. A hum of engines made us look up. A Coast Guard cutter was bearing down on us, spotlight cutting across the waves. I nearly wept with relief. They hauled us aboard, half dead with dehydration and shock. When we asked about the majestic wanderer, they said they found no such ship. Radar never picked it up. They'd only noticed our raft drifting about 20 miles off the coast. The official logs insisted the majestic wanderer's reappearance was still unconfirmed rumor. I tried to show them photos, but all the images on Dana's memory card were corrupt, glitchy streaks of static. Our phones were equally useless, data wiped or scrambled. We spent days in a hospital in Key West. Doctors said we were dehydrated, sunburned, suffering from stress-induced hallucinations. Nobody believed our story. The media had a flurry of headlines about a rumored ghost ship, but with no evidence, it fizzled quickly. Sometimes, late at night, I wake up soaked in sweat, hearing that hum in my dreams. I see that rotted steward, the woman in the lounge, the flickering illusions of 1972. I can't shake the feeling that we never truly escaped, that a part of us is still out there in that warped dimension. Dana moved to the Midwest, refusing to set foot near an ocean again. Marcus quit journalism entirely, calling it a day on the impossible. Shayla holed up in a cabin by a lake, trying to bury herself in mundane research. As for me, I can't let it go. I spend my days scouring old documents, searching for any other mention of that device, those symbols, any shred of proof that we're not insane. I never found the majestic wanderer's final resting place. Maybe it drifted back into the triangle, that cursed place where time and reality bend. Or maybe it'll appear again someday, luring new victims onto its decks. If you hear rumors of an old cruise ship found adrift, think twice before going aboard. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed, and some horrors defy all logic, existing in the darkest corners where no one expects them. If you ever see a battered hull on the horizon, with letters spelling out majestic wanderer, do yourself a favor, turn around, and sail the other way. Because once you step into that realm of flickering lights and endless corridors, the Bermuda Triangle's jaws might snap shut, swallowing you in the same twisted fate that almost devoured us. And if you're unlucky enough to come back at all, you may never again be sure of what's real and what's just another echo from the dark heart of the Devil's Triangle.